Everybody's here.
All right. Well, thank you, Matthew, once again for hosting us. We appreciate and welcome everybody. Hope you're doing well this morning. It is great to see your faces and your numbers and everything else. Let's open with a word of thanks. Holy and gracious God, we are grateful to be gathered in this marvelous way to think about your word and how it inspires our lives. Be with us by Spirit through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So this morning, we're going to talk about two prophets, Micah and Hosea. And both of them lived about the same time, and they both lived in the southern kingdom. Isaiah, probably from Jerusalem. He was more like a court prophet, sort of arranged with kings and had access to the kings. And Micah was more a country boy, but they lived at about the same time. And this is, again, about 700 years before Jesus. And the whole story is told with the Assyrian menace hanging over the whole narrative. Assyria is from modern day Iraq, and they had become quite the warrior nation. And one of the big events that happens in our narrative is in 721, Assyria destroys the northern kingdom, the capital of Samaria for Israel. And Isaiah will comment on that. And then the next big date is 701, when Sennacherib's army, the Assyrian king, will surround Jerusalem. And so those two big events hover over the entire prophetic career of Micah and Isaiah. And what's interesting in the Second Kings rendition of this story is Isaiah is the first of the writing prophets to be named in Second Kings. So he has that pride of place among the writers of Second Kings. So for just a brief moment, let's think about what Micah and Isaiah have in common. Well, one thing they have in common is this, that they are both told to give what is called a prophetic sign to Jerusalem about what's going to happen to them with the Assyrians. And guess what the sign is? And you can read about this in the first chapter of Micah and in the 20th chapter of Isaiah. Both of them are told to walk through the city streets of Jerusalem naked as a sign of what's going to happen to the northern kingdom, Samaria. When they are conquered, they're going to be taken away and be stripped of their clothes. So Micah and Isaiah both apparently walk through the city streets without clothes on. Now that'll get people's attention, won't it? Then both of them have this marvelous message about a future peace when your swords will be beaten into plowshares and your spears will be beaten into pruning hooks. You'll find the identical phrase in Isaiah 4 and in Micah 4 and Isaiah 2. So they're obviously talking about the same thing because the exact same verse is found in both Micah and Isaiah. And thirdly, both of them depict what the problem is in Jerusalem. And the problem is that the leaders are cruel, they're indifferent to the poor, and they're predators on the most vulnerable. So Micah and Isaiah see the problem identically, that the leadership is indifferent and cruel and avaricious, and both of them condemn the leaders. Well, I want you also to know one other thing. When we get to Jeremiah, we're going to find in chapter 26 of Jeremiah that the story of Micah is retold in Jeremiah. And maybe I'll hold that for a couple of weeks, but just remember this. When the prophet Jeremiah is preaching to Jerusalem, he quotes from Micah. And let's see how that unfolds when we deal with Jeremiah in a couple of weeks. All right, so let's now talk about Isaiah. Isaiah has this incredibly long ministry, maybe 40 years. Most scholars think he started about 740 and he ended around 701. So it's about a 40-year run. And it is a very diverse and complex prophetic materials. But one of the things you might want to know is that Isaiah seems to have access to all the kings. They seem to bring him in as a kind of court prophet. And one of his first experiences is when he's dealing with Ahaz, a king that is really, really pretty bad king. In fact, he's such a bad king that at one point he offers his own son in sacrifice to a pagan god. Now, that's a bad king in Jerusalem, right? And in Isaiah 7, uh, Isaiah 7, 9, and 11 are used in our Christmas text about a child will be given, a sign will be given, those sort of passages. And you can read them if you have time. But here's what you might want to know. In the original context of those, what we call messianic prophecies of Isaiah 2 and 7 and 9, it probably was originally referring to the birth of Ahaz's son, Hezekiah, who we'll spend most of our time talking about. So I'm not going to go into all the technical aspects of this, but I just want you to know that in the original context of those Christmas narratives that we hear so often, it's probably originally referring to the birth of Hezekiah, who turns out to be quite a good king. It's very odd because King Ahaz is the father of Hezekiah, and then Hezekiah is the father of Manasseh. Well, Ahaz is not a good king. He sacrifices his own son. Manasseh, his son, is not a good king. He sacrifices his own son to a pagan god. In fact, Manasseh is considered the worst king in Judah's history. So here's this good king sandwiched in between a dad and a son who were rotten. And it's a pretty amazing story, and I thought you'd want to know about that. So let's think about Isaiah and his relationship to King Hezekiah, who is a good king. This is a remarkable tale. And you might be interested to know that this whole relationship between Isaiah and Hezekiah, the good king, is told in 3 different versions. You'll find it in 2 Chronicles 29 through 32. You'll find it in Isaiah 36 through 38. And you'll find it in 2 Kings 18 through 20. And what does this show? It shows how important this interaction was between Hezekiah the king and Isaiah the prophet. So this past week, I had a lot of fun studying Chronicles. I hadn't studied Chronicles in a while. But if you look at the story in 2 Chronicles 29 through 32, you're told that King Hezekiah was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 29 years. And what he did at the very beginning of his reign is so important. He purifies the temple because his father, Ahaz, the bad king, had brought all these pagan sites and shrines into the temple and had really sort of brought it into disrepute. So Hezekiah, quote, cleanses the temple. He takes out all those foreign influences, and he gets the Levites and the priests to sort of purify themselves and get themselves in right relationship to God so that they can offer the sacrifices. So the temple is rededicated under Hezekiah, 2 Chronicles 29, and the place is filled with sacrifices of animals, and it's very interesting, songs of praise are singing throughout the temple. And one of the things that was most interesting to me is in 2 Chronicles 29:30, it says the Levites sang the songs of David and Asaph, A-S-A-P-H. And those of you who are interested in the Psalms, there are 11 of these Psalms attributed to Asaph, Psalm 73 to 83. So it is a great rededication of the temple. Then in chapter 30, Hezekiah says, we haven't celebrated the Passover around here in so long. So what Hezekiah does is he gives an invitation to all of Israel and all of Judah to come to Jerusalem and celebrate the Passover, which seems to suggest that they'd gone years without celebrating the Passover. So they send messengers all over the country, and it says in some parts of the northern part of Israel, they scoffed at him and laughed. Aha, that can't be. And Hezekiah brings everyone into Jerusalem, and there is a massive celebration of the Passover. And in fact, the text says it goes so well after 7 days of celebration, they do 7 more. And so there are tons and tons of animal sacrifices. There's singing, there is celebration. Everybody's happy. I would say in some senses, maybe this is one of the happiest chapters in the entire Bible. 2 Chronicles 30. If you're looking for an uplifting story in these times, 2 Chronicles 30. There's your text. And then Hezekiah in chapter 31 destroys all those high places and pagan altars all across the countryside of Judah and Israel. And this is really a fabulous thing he's doing. And then here's what happens. He asks people to bring gifts to Jerusalem, and people bring so many gifts that he has to build these huge storehouses for all the gold and the silver and all the rest. And remember that, because that storehouse will come up again in just a few moments. So at the end of 2 Chronicles 31, it is a happy scene. The Passover has been celebrated. The storehouses are full. We're singing the Psalms of David and Asaph, and all is good. Well, let's skip from there to Isaiah 36, where the story continues. The story gets a little more tense in chapter 36 of Isaiah. Why? Well, the Assyrian army that has previously destroyed Samaria in 727 has come down now, 721, I'm sorry, has come down in 701 and surrounded Jerusalem. And Sennacherib's army is powerful. And so Sennacherib sends one of his officials, and he stands outside the gates of Jerusalem, and he speaks in Hebrew to all the people who are up on the top of the wall, and he says to them, surrender. We Assyrians are so powerful, we've destroyed all these cities, and we've destroyed all these other gods, and more importantly, we've been told that your God has summoned us to destroy you. Now, this is a very interesting theological move on the part of the Assyrian spokesman. He's basically saying, we're here because God has called us to destroy you. And guess what? Isaiah agrees with him. Isaiah agrees that the Assyrian army has been summoned to do this act of judgment against Jerusalem. And then at this point, the Jewish officials on top of the wall say, don't speak anymore in Hebrew. You're frightening the people. Please speak in Aramaic. And the Assyrian official continues to speak in Hebrew. And he says, don't listen to Hezekiah and don't listen to all of his religious talk. Surrender to us. And guess what we'll do? We're going to deport you to a real nice place that you'll really like living in. It's marvelous political talk. And the Assyrians say, we've crushed other gods, we'll crush you as well. And even there's a note of humor here. The Assyrian official says, look, you don't have any power to stop us. I'd give you 2,000 horses to come out and attack us if you could find 2,000 riders, meaning you don't even have 2,000 horsemen to go with these 2,000. So give it up. Well, guess what happens in chapter 37? Isaiah 37 tells us that these Jewish officials tear their clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and they go to the temple and they pray to the Lord. And the king Hezekiah says, go consult with the prophet Isaiah. and maybe Isaiah has a word from the Lord for us. And guess what? Isaiah does. And the word from the Lord is, don't be afraid of the Assyrians. They will not be successful in their attack. Hang in, don't be afraid. And furthermore, the Assyrian army will be destroyed. So hang tough, don't be afraid. Then at this point, Hezekiah goes to the temple and prays God and thanks God for this good news. And Isaiah's message to him again is, God in the heavens laughs at the Assyrians. They cannot conquer you. So at this point, a marvelous thing happens for Israel. An angel of death, the text says, goes into the Assyrian army and kills 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Wow. So at this point, the Assyrian army that's left over withdraws back to Assyria, and Sennacherib then is killed in one of the pagan temples by two of his sons, and the threat is averted. Oh, thanks be to God. And Jerusalem is spared. Now, at this point, you think, oh man, this is a good story. He's rededicated the temple. They've escaped the Assyrian onslaught. And then in chapter 38, just when you thought everything was going great, Hezekiah gets sick. And he's told, prepare to die by the Lord. And Hezekiah cries and weeps and prays that God would somehow spare him. And so Isaiah again is consulted, and Isaiah now is sort of like a physician. He says, take some fig paste and put it on the boils of the king, and he'll get better. And indeed, what happens is Hezekiah wants a sign from God. Signs happen a lot in these stories, that I'll really be healed. And so what happens? Well, Isaiah says, you know those steps going into the temple? What I'm going to do is I'm going to make the shadow from the sun fall back 10 steps that will convince you that you're really going to be healed. And indeed, the steps, the shadows fall back, and indeed, Hezekiah is healed. So again, you think, boy, this is a great story. Everything is turning out marvelously until we get to chapter 39. And in chapter 39, Babylon, who had been an ally with Jerusalem against the Assyrians, hears that Hezekiah has been healed of his illness. So they send a messenger and gifts to Hezekiah in Jerusalem, congratulating him that he both escaped the Assyrians and that he was healed of his illness. And while that Babylonian messenger is there, guess what Hezekiah does? Remember I told you about the storehouses? Well, he shows the Babylonian official all of his storehouses, where all of his gold and silver is and all of his precious metals. It is really quite a sight to see. And Isaiah the prophet gets wind that the Babylonian official has seen all of Hezekiah's storehouse. And Isaiah says, what have you done? He says, well, look, they're an ally, and I wanted to show them our stuff, that we were prepared. And here's what Isaiah the prophet says to him. All that stuff in your storehouse, it's all going to be stolen someday by the Babylonians, and your descendants are going to be taken into exile by the Babylonians. Wow, that's bad news. But Hezekiah now decides to interpret this, as we say, as lipstick on a pig. And he says, oh, well, that means that I'm going to be okay. So that's going to happen later on. Well, then it's all good. That's really good news. And you're thinking to yourself, what kind of guy would say that? So at the end of the story, Hezekiah ends up being a little bit more ambiguous than previously. Now, one other thing I might tell you, Second Kings 20 will describe Hezekiah's death, and they always describe where he's buried. He said, buried in Jerusalem. And here's one little note in Second Kings 20:20. It says that Hezekiah, knowing that the Assyrians were about to come down, redirected a spring that would go underneath Jerusalem and cut a tunnel so that the water would flow into Jerusalem and not be stopped by, say, an Assyrian army. Now, those of you who have journeyed to Jerusalem might remember that Hezekiah's tunnel is still under Jerusalem. I walked through Hezekiah's tunnel, and there's still a little trickle of water going through that. So 2 Kings 20:20 tells you this small little detail of one result of Hezekiah's kingship, and it's still there. Now, the bad news at the end of Hezekiah's reign is this, that his son is born, and his name's Manasseh, and he's the worst king in Israel's history. So you're sort of stunned that Hezekiah's father was Ahaz, who was a sorry king and sacrificed his own son. His son, Hezekiah's son, is Manasseh, who ended up sacrificing his own son and was considered the worst king in Israel's history. And how is it that Hezekiah turned out so well? Well, here's my theory. My theory is very simple. He had Isaiah, and Isaiah was an enormous help to him in rededicating the temple, dealing with the Assyrian threat, dealing with his own mortality and his near death. So it's Isaiah that gives him that sort of stability. And maybe a final thought here would be this. How kings and leaders and presidents and prime ministers and all the rest, queens, how much they need good advisors and people who are wise and faithful. And maybe in all the history of Israel's kingship, there was no better prophetic advisor to any king than Isaiah was to Hezekiah. And so Hezekiah ends up being this shining light. And at the end of his life in 2 Kings 20, it says that he did what was right. He did what was right. And maybe we can attribute a lot of that to Isaiah. So a little question for our consideration. How important is it to have a prophetic voice that really does speak faithfully for God and can influence those who are our leaders? Wouldn't that be nice? So those are my thoughts. And now I would love to hear your thoughts. What have we done today? We've talked about Hezekiah and Isaiah as it's told in really three different versions, in 2 Chronicles, in Isaiah, and in 2 Kings. What a story it really is. So now, Matthew, you can unmute folks and